We're going to go over some scripting best practices today. My name is Mike Westendorf. I'm a Senior Technical Project Manager at DB Services. Like I said earlier, it's a smaller group, so if you guys have any questions, just feel free to raise your hand or shout them out. We'll take them as we go. I would like to just go around the room a little bit and find out about everybody here. So we'll start over here with this guy.
My name is Kevin. I just recently started with DB Services. I'm pretty new to FileMaker. This is my first one of these situations.
Chief Boswell. I did an independent, in-house, back independent for the last 20-so years, FileMaker.
Very cool.
And, kind of taking it easy right now.
Sounds like it.
I'm Patrick Evans. I started a year and a month ago at DB. That was my first time with FileMaker, so got a little bit of my life.
Hi, I'm John. I've actually used FileMaker about 3 years ago.
Okay.
And I was on Meetup and I saw this, this guy's still around?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious. I just wanted to see what level they had.
Oh, I appreciate you coming.
My name is Brian. I'm a systems admin, civil engineering firm. And I was kind of playing around with learning.
Very cool.
Jeremiah, I'm another senior technical PM at Deep Services.
All right. So today, like I said, we're talking about scripting. I guess the way we like to look at this thing is when you're doing coding, the one way to look at it is to choose two of these. You can either make it work, easy to read, and quick to write. It's really hard to hit all three. Personally, I usually like to go with it works and it's easy to read. I don't mind taking a little more time to make it work well and easy to read and have follow conventions that everyone can follow, especially when you work in a team dynamic like we do. It's really important to have everything go well together. Time saving. So humans are the most expensive part of the application development cycle. So what we like to do is we like to template things, put together conventions, and write scannable code. You'll see I have a screenshot here. We'll get into some of these things, but always at the top we like to put a purpose, the start and end context, because FileMaker is purely context-based. No matter where you're at, it's always going to be in a context. And then right under that, you'll always see our our audit logger changes. So proper context, like I mentioned, ensure script is running from intended context. So this is, it's a huge time savings thing. You're going to create fewer bugs if you pay attention to these things in the beginning. Generic scripts, they get a little tricky. You're basically assuming any context when you run them, but usually they handle that anyways. Air trapping scripts. So one thing you'll see in a lot of our code is these three scripts at the top of every script. They have a specific purpose, each one of them. You don't always use all three of them, but you need to know when to use them. So if the script starts, the first one's halt if not in browse mode. Essentially, it does exactly what it says. So if they're in find mode and they happen to run this script, it'll just stop. Example of that might be they're trying to add line items, to the thing. And with newer features of 16, that kind of made this obsolete because you could hide buttons or deprecate buttons. But that's the intention. You want to make sure that they're in the correct mode before it runs. Halt if no records in found set. Same thing. If you're expecting a record to be there and it's not, the script will just stop. And the third one to me is the most important, commit record and halt if invalid. So when you're running a script, it's going to always want to, essentially you either have your record open or locked, or it's sitting there waiting to do something. And you want to start with a clean slate, so to speak. So if you know the script started with a committed state and everything's been saved, then anything you do inside the script, you started with a clean slate and you can end with a clean slate. So that's an important one in my book. Air trapping. So of course, why would you air trap? You want to write code that's not going to be buggy for one. You want to empower your users, giving them accurate, error messages is going to be the quickest way for them to figure out what happened and get to the bottom of it without having to call us or you guys. It helps speed up troubleshooting. So if you give them detailed error messages and not just generic ones, they'll be able to give you the message and you'll be able to quickly and accurately pop it back out. And furthermore, if you're building for someone else, like I think all of us do, you're creating user trust. You want them to believe in the system, that it works well. And if you're giving them accurate, good, detailed messages, they will have more trust in the system. How many of you guys do air trapping? Better see some hands up from you two. Okay, Jer. Allow user board off. Again, to me, this is always at the top of my scripts. I've never seen an instance where it actually makes sense to allow them to hit the escape key and get out of a script. I handle everything within the script. If they're going to need to cancel, if you put them in a loop or a pause, don't let them just back out themselves. Give them ways to do it on the screen through the interface. The set error capture on. All that's doing is it grabs any of the errors that FileMaker would normally show to the user and suppresses them. And then you can use the get last error script step to get the error code, parse it, figure out what you want to do with it, and show it back to the user. Oh, and there it is. So with the set error capture on, like I said, it will give you the information you need, and then that allows you to translate that and give a detailed error message. Like I said, user, and helps the developer do the troubleshooting. So in this one, you can see it's cleanly written. There was a problem adding the contact information to the invoice. It tells you what you were trying to do, where you were trying to do it, and then the error below is mainly for the developer, but it's something that we would recognize if they read it back to us. In this case, the relationship is missing. Essentially, this is kind of a weird error because that basically means someone probably went through and purged one of the TOs of the relationships, which is not cool. The exit script step. This is one actually, when I was an in-house developer, I had never used this. I learned this at DB years ago. It's very powerful though. You essentially want an exit at the bottom of every one of your scripts. When you're using the debugger and walking through things, it'll allow you to, you can step into that one. If not, the script debugger will just close as soon as you do the last step. So you can't see if the last step really functioned correctly or not. So it's very powerful. Also, if you were doing subscripts, of course, you can pass results back to the parent script using this. Air trapping. So we're going to talk a little bit about what things to air trap. You've got the new record, delete record, set field, go to related record, and then interacting with systems outside of FileMaker. So the important ones are like the new record. Essentially, you're wanting to make sure the record actually got created. If someone is working in the database schema and they have the table locked because they're managing the field definitions, and someone tries to create a record, it's not going to let it go through. If you don't air trap for the worst case scenario, the script's going to keep running. The user's not going to know any better, and maybe it goes through and sets a bunch of fields in the current record instead of a new one. I've seen this in systems we've inherited before. You walk into a customer and I'm like, what's your main issue? Well, sometimes data just changes, so you start troubleshooting, look at the code. Are they doing any proper air trapping? Because it would prevent this. The delete record, same thing. You want to make sure the delete actually happened before you go on to the next step. Otherwise, it could have a negative impact to your code. Set field is essentially the same reason as the new record. You want to make sure you have access to the record you're trying to set. When you first set any field within the context, so if let's say you're setting a related field, so you have an order system, you created a new order, that order is now locked until you commit. If you're going to then set the line items, every time you set a new line item record or the first time you touch the record in the line items, you should air trap it. So after the first time, it's locked and it's yours. But if you don't air trap it the first time, it will, you may not be able to edit that record and you wouldn't know. That's essentially what our sample code here is showing. Lock the record, open, abandon beginning transaction. So after the last error, if the last error is not equal to 0, he's giving the error message, reverting the record. And in this particular case, he's setting some log fields in our transaction table, and then goes back and returns the error. Let's see here. We've got go to related record here highlighted. It's kind of a unique one. There's instances where if you tried to just error trap the go to related record, it may throw you an error even though it actually worked. The best thing to do is just to grab the starting layout, do your go to related record, and make sure the layout changed. Because if the layout changed, then you know it worked. Otherwise, it'll leave you on the same layout. Interacting with systems outside of FileMaker. That could involve two things. You could be writing web code that's talking to FileMaker using like the API engine. You want to make sure you're doing the same type of error trapping that we're doing here. You know, new records, delete, set fields. Or you're using FileMaker to interact with a third-party system. So you're pulling things from an API. You want to check to make sure you got the proper response back that you were expecting, because if you didn't get the proper response back, of course you don't want your script to continue. Comments. There's quite a few slides in here about comments. I'm a big believer in it. So not all comments are created equal. They should be readable. They should be really clear, and they should have good scannability. Readability. So like I mentioned earlier, at the top we have our housekeeping. That's who created it, and then below you'll see other dates and the initials and what they changed in the script. Every one of these has section headers, so code's broken out into sections. We've got our initialize, handle UI errors, populate parameters, and then you just get in different sections. So like this script down here is saying before find or enter find mode. This is more of a generic script, but the idea is the same. You want everything broke out into sections. And then the spacing is important as well. We particularly like to have double spaces between the sections just for scannability. Excuse me. You know, and you compare that to something like this that essentially just had no comments in it. It's you know, much easier to scan and read this than it is to read something like this. Here you can see they added minimal spacing, so it's a little better, but it's still pretty hard to parse through. And you still have no indication of what the intention was. And here, this is a sample of, you know, you could say this has too many comments because it's pretty clear what they're trying to do on a lot of these. Check for cancellation. The variable name alone says, you know, selection cancel flag. It's pretty inherited. The if statement right after it says if canceled, so you can back right out of it. You could probably skip some of these comments. I'll never say too many comments is a bad thing, but if you're going for readability and scannability, you know, you do have a possibility of having too many in there. Clear sections. So in this one here, they're defined. So you have the populate parameters, open a new window, isolate their line items, and then finally go to the print form and print it out, set display settings. And these, like I said, these are just some examples. Commenting clarity versus noise. So what we like to do for clarity is, I mean, you're trying to identify things that people would look at and not inherently know what they mean. This one, you know, it says find order. So you inherently know that I'm just trying to find an order. I mean, it's straightforward, but I'm trying to think of an example. Sorry, I'm having a hard time popping off my head. I guess one thing would be like the sort script steps. A lot of times I won't say just like sort records. I'll put in a second comment below it that it has the sort order, so that you don't have to pop open the script step every time you want to read it or see what it was sorted by.
Sort by field helps you out with that nowadays.
Yeah, there's a newer script step, sort by field name. That works great. It just limits you to one field. So as long as you're not trying to do a multi-sort.
Yeah, the idea being that you're reading a script, anything that's going to impact the behavior of the script further down, you want to be able to read it without clicking into the details. Like, you don't need to do that with variables per se. By the name of the variable, you should know what that variable is doing. But like sorts records, you don't know what's being sorted without clicking into it. The sort records by field at least shows you the name of the field, so you don't have to do that.
Right. Hidden and stacked objects. This isn't really scripting related, but I think it's pertinent just as far as hidden and stacked objects go. So you can see off to the side of the layout, we've got this field off to the side. The user can't actually see it, but we went ahead and put a notation, a comment there. Do not delete this. It's being used to look up the city, state, and country based on a zip code. So essentially, on the screen off to the middle there, where it says postal code, you type in a zip code. It runs a script trigger that uses the field off to the right to grab the information. It's just, again, in team environments, sometimes you get people who like to clean things up. So if you don't put a comment over there, they may end up just deleting it. Or even just yourself. I mean, I've worked in systems long enough that I forget what something is sometimes. Commenting, the most important thing is actually doing it. Update comments as you code. Create a template script with sections. So one thing I like about the subsections and the headers, I kind of use them as pseudocode. So if I'm writing a brand new script, I will go through a lot of times and branch out and put those section headers in first. And then I'll go back through and start filling in the code. So, I mean, most people taking programming, pseudocode is essentially just a written language of what the code step by step should be doing at a high level. So that's how I treat those things. And it helps me basically get it in there and write it faster. And then I already have the comments in place. Moving on a bit to modular code. I mean, modular code is essentially using your code, reusing your code over and over. So the pros and cons, it can save time testing or updating. Can also add time to later updates. The biggest thing I would say is don't over-engineer it. I mean, we've inherited some systems that were totally over-engineered. Almost every single script step was a subscript. I mean, it was crazy to entwine that thing and figure out what they were actually trying to do. But it was hyper modularized. You called this script, called this script, called this script. I see it a lot too with navigation systems, where you have a drop down list on the screen, and then the navigation is just perform script, perform script, perform script with a big if else branch. I mean, it works. Sometimes it's just harder to maintain. So here's an example of what I would consider too much. Essentially what they did was the script is supposed to do a submit and an edit, where to me they're two separate complete functions. That would warrant two scripts. You have a submit script or an edit script. And what they did is they tried to branch them together, which I think there's another screenshot right here. You can see their if-else branch where it's if submit, if edit, do this. Now, in the beginning, it probably wasn't that big a deal because this is a really short code, but I could go pull this script out of the actual system it's in, and the submit alone is probably 5-6 times that amount of lines, just because as the system grew. So you kind of gain a knowledge of what kind of scripts are going to grow over time and what aren't, so you know out of the gate just to split them up. I do like to split these kinds of things up where it's a pretty main function to any system, being able to submit it or edit the record. I do want to talk a little bit about script parameters. So FileMaker 16 introduced the ability to use JSON, which I think is awesome. It basically gave us a standard that is now native to FileMaker for passing script parameters. The big crux before was you can only pass one parameter, so everyone had their own way of or standard of passing multiple parameters. And there were some community adopted ones out there, but I would think that pretty much everyone should gravitate towards this because it's native. You don't have to carry around custom functions, or you don't have to learn a different language just to pass parameters. It allows for multiple data types. Names are case sensitive though, so you got to remember that. So where I have tracking number, it's a capital N. You have to use a capital N when you try to retrieve it as well. And you will lose any formatting, just so you know if you passed it through, because it treats it as strings. We had a friend of ours text us one day, and he's like, "Did you know it loses the formatting?" He was trying to build this complex text formatting, almost like Word would, and he passed it through JSON, and when he got it back, all the special formatting was gone. So that was an interesting comment I thought I would share. The JSON types. So essentially at the end of the JSON, you can see the format. We say JSON string on the back end because I'm passing a string of text, a tracking number. You can also do strings, numbers, objects, arrays, booleans, null, or raw. So The arrays become powerful when you're trying to pass multiple things inside of itself. The rest of them are pretty straightforward. The Boolean will return a true or false as you expect it to. So in typical FileMaker, if you give it a 1 or any essentially any non-zero value, it'll return true or false. Raw, actually looked that up. So for the thing, I think it was passing any raw. I don't want to use the word raw, but I think that's how it was described. They're essentially passing the data as raw JSON. I believe that's what it was. Jared's going to tell me in a second. The
JSON raw is you're just telling the JSON parser to figure out the data type.
Oh.
So if you don't necessarily know, just say JSON raw and then it figures out the data type for you.
I have not used it.
Yeah, I mean normally you know the data type, so
Right.
it's explicitly set.
Same with like JSON null. I haven't yet to find a use for that one.
Null.
Yeah.
You do need that if you're passing a null value to an API that
Correct.
is parsing JSON.
Right.
But yes,
In pure FileMaker for script parameters, though,
No,
FileMaker doesn't really have a concept of null. Yeah, it doesn't care. The two main JSON functions, there's others, but these are the two you're going to use the most when you're passing as parameters. Set element, so you can give it a starting JSON value. You give it the key index, or essentially the name, then the value and the type. And then when you want to get it back, you just say JSON get element. You give it the JSON, so this might be like get script parameter. The key or index, which is case sensitive, like I mentioned before, and it'll return the value. If it can't find it, it'll return, a question mark and an error. If it can't find it and the JSON's formatted properly, it'll just give you an empty string. But if the JSON's malformed, you'll get an error, which is just important to know depending on how you're using your parameters. Evaluate. So I'll just talk a little bit about indirection. I actually gave a presentation to the same group years ago on indirection, but indirection is essentially hard coding anything or referencing itself in a way that FileMaker doesn't know what you reference. So if you said execute SQL is another one besides evaluate, you basically put in quotes the table and field name, and then FileMaker, if you ever renamed it, you're essentially going to break your code. So, I mean, as a general rule of thumb, we try to avoid these things. You get tempted to hard code field names, like I said, it's slower than native because it has to basically translate it and evaluate it, and then FileMaker has to parse it back out. And there could be some inherent security risks if you've got things hard coded in there. It's a funny comic we've seen, but you've got the mom on the phone. Hi, this is your son's school. We're having some computer trouble. Oh dear, did he break something? And the person on the line goes, did you really name your son Robert Drop Table Students? And she goes, oh yes, little Bobby Tables we call him. And then the person on the other end's aggravated. Well, we've lost this year's student records. I hope you're happy. And she goes, and I hope you learn to sanitize your database inputs. So I like it because it's basically like a SQL injection joke. Just some tips and tricks. So the script debugger, I mean, everyone in here is familiar with the script debugger and the tools in the advanced, FileMaker Advanced? Yes, no. What I like to do, and I know some of my counterparts might disagree with me, I like to use the second button on the script debugger, which essentially is stepping into your script. So what that's going to do is it's just going to go line by line. And if it ever comes across another perform script or subscript, it's actually going to go into it and show it to you. The first button will perform the perform script like on line 13, but it won't show you that it did it. It'll just perform it in the background and keep going. The third button there steps out, so if you did actually step into line 13, you see the other script, you can step out of it right away with the third button, which means it's going to run it and just bring you back to the next step. It's a subtle difference, but I think it's better for troubleshooting because if you ever stepped over a script that actually ran, you don't know if there was any errors inside of it, and that could be causing your bugs. Off to the right, you've got the turn off script trigger button. So if you have triggers running on your layout through fields and you want to see if they're causing the problem, you could quickly turn off the triggers, and then you'd be able to test it without the triggers running. Sometimes we're opening large systems that have multiple files. We'll turn the script triggers off so that the files open without the open scripts, just to make it faster to get into them. And then the data viewer. So the data viewer is one of my favorite tools. We use it in combination with the script debugger. Essentially, the current tab will show you all the active fields and variables while your script is running. So if you're stepping through a script, it'll actually highlight the fields that are being used in that particular script step. It shows you the variables as you get to them. The watch tab then essentially gives you full access to the calculation engine in FileMaker. So it's pretty powerful. So a lot of times I will write the calculations in there, copy them, and paste them right into like the field level definitions in managed database. So basically it gives you a way to test things without actually putting them into the calc in the field itself. Naming code. So one thing you want to do is naming variables. You want to name them well. They should be self-describing, like a noun. Unique names. Essentially, there's no right answer, but you do want them to be easily readable to follow our mantra and everything else. I just want to go look at, so like here it's called task name. We always capitalize all of our constants and do an underscore between them, just as a convention. We do lower camel case on like tracking number carrier variables the same way. That one. And do we have any questions? I was hoping for more questions. Patrick.
Yeah, I did have a question on the evaluate function.
Yeah.
What exactly is it, and why would you ever use it?
Why would you want to use it? I've never had an actual use for it. Maybe Jared can spit one out. He's shaking his head at me, so he's got an example in
You
mind.
haven't had a complex data model thrown away.
What?
You haven't had a complex data model thrown away. So basically, evaluate is, there might be moments where you need to run FileMaker code, but you have to get the components like data driven. Like the most common way I've seen it happen is I'm building like a rules table, like paperless auto archiving.
The myth.
Yes. If you set a rule where it's like you have the user actually put these rules in, like the price must be less than 20, and then this thing happens, that they get to select the operator. They select the field they want. They're basically like writing code, but in a data-driven way. And then to actually execute that code, you've got to put it all together in a FileMaker like way, and then evaluate that so it actually evaluates. Does that make sense? So you'd actually like.
So like this, like you could like stick a find.
No, so like
it's a
in
calculation.
a simple example, if you told it evaluate 2 plus 2, it's going to give you 4.
And if you just gave FileMaker 2 plus 2 in quotes, it would just return 2 plus 2 because that's a piece of text.
Because it's literal text.
It's a way for you to evaluate a piece of text as a calculation.
Okay.
You know, if you did evaluate order, ID, and that's your serial number, it's going to give you whatever that number is. Where otherwise it would just give you the word as text without the evaluate wrapped around it.
Yeah, but when it comes to a practical use case that's safe, and you're not hard coding a bunch of stuff, the most common thing I've seen is when I'm building like rules for actual users to put together, and then your code executes those rules based on what they put together. So, like I think with the email archiving that we're trying to do in our internal system, we've got like a portal that I haven't shown anybody since Kevin, where you can say if the email address and then you select contains or equals, and I think I had to use evaluate for part of that to get it to work.
Yeah, I had built something like that in my previous life. I just try to avoid those things when I'm working with people because it's confusing.
Yeah. So.
And then what kind of security errors does that bring up?
Oh, that's why it's partly a concern. If you're not careful, that's just like the Bobby tables you could inject.
Correct.
FileMaker code in a text field, and then bad things could potentially happen. With FileMaker, calculations are pretty isolated. You can't. There's not a whole lot that you can do with calculations to affect the data.
No, you would end up just change the data itself, basically.
I guess you could with if you knew that there was like a plugin that did SQL. Like it would take some in-depth knowledge to be able to truly screw up. You know?
Which, I mean, most security risks take an in-depth knowledge in the first place. You know what I mean? You couldn't
Yeah,
inject something into SQL
That's
without
true.
knowing SQL to begin with.
Yeah.
So delete all one book?
What's that?
Delete all one book?
No, luckily. But if there was a plugin and you knew the plugin function to perform script, and you knew the script name, delete all records, that would evaluate and it would fire the script. So there are definitely some security holes, but you'd have to have a lot of in-depth knowledge on the system, the script names, the plugins that were installed, everything.
What about
Oops.
we cover like how to structure scripts, like subscripting, or I don't know if you want to go into that at all. Like when do you make subscripts? And, you know, is there anything special that you need to do?
Subscript. So when to make a subscript. Essentially, when you want to be able to reuse the code, I mean, that's the simplest way to look at it. Any time you're trying to make it modular to reuse it, you could throw it into a subscript. Looping is a good example. If you had a complex loop, you could throw it into a subscript, or if you're running, a lot of times we'll build systems with transactions, a transaction table that processes everything. It gives you an audit log of the transaction, and you're allowed to call those transactions from any context as long as you pass them the correct parameters, because then they're going to behave and do what they need to do anyways. So.
You guys have any questions or anything for us from scripting challenges that you run into?
Or
any things that you
or any non-scripting. I finished way early, so.
Yeah, we can talk about anything. Can you make your slides available?
They usually put them out on well, yes. We have your email. I'll make sure you get them, but they usually broadcast them on SlideShare, I think. Yeah, keep doing that. Thinking there's another slide. So.
What about I got more things to talk about scripting.
Go ahead.
I know that when I'm scripting, I try to make the top script, the top level script, handle UI stuff.
Correct.
And then any subscripts do not assume any UI. They don't show dialogues. They don't freeze windows. They just handle data stuff. The idea behind that is you could take that subscript and call it from multiple places, multiple different types of UIs, and it would still work because all it's doing is passing you up either the result or an error code, and then your script, that's actually the calling script that can then determine how to show that to the user, whether it's a server-side schedule where that would email like a developer if something went wrong, or if